How's everyone today? Good, good, good. Right answer. So, it's a pleasure to be here. It's my 12th visit to India. Yay. And as India builds from, I guess, $250 billion, 250 billion market of technology to reach $1 trillion at some point, which will be, I don't know, moving from 8% of your GDP to 0.25% of your GDP, that is phenomenal growth, and this is the engine room for that. The caveat is that it might not be done in the same way as it was done in the past, and it might not be by following the advice of your consultants or even your CEO. And so we're going to look at what that means to have some uncertainty in our life, which we actually think is a good thing. Have any of you wondered how come the US Fed, Jane Yellen, can stand up to the world and say that she had no idea that inflation would be the highest in half a century, that they thought they could control inflation, and that despite having the best statisticians and supercomputers in the world, or one of the best, they were at a loss? Have you wondered why and how and the ramifications of Germany spending decades relying on one little assumption, the assumption that if they kept a strong relationship with their partner, Russia, that it would provide them energy, military, and defense security, and the cost of that assumption? Or when Silicon Valley went bust, the second largest US bank, how come, despite one or two maybe stupid assumptions, it took 10 seconds for them to go bust, which was not the case in 2008 in the financial crisis, probably because of social media, maybe even unrelated to the bad assumptions they made in governance. So we're going to look at what that means and the nature of change that's changing. And one of the things I believe is that with an inverse relationship between uncertainty and predictability, the cost of relying on assumptions of a stable, predictable, and controllable world are increasing. And all those three examples are, amongst many others, the dangers of isolating and narrowing your assumptions to the exclusion of anything else. Nothing wrong with running models, nothing wrong with trying to think about the interest rates. The danger is when you do that to the exclusion of anything else with the absolute confidence that you have a stable, linear, predictable world. We see disruption in three different evolutions. The first one was Joseph Schumpeter, the Austrian economist. After the Second World War, when Europe was in reconstruction mode, and a lot of his work in the 1940s was around creative destruction. It's institutional, things get destroyed, damaged, but it also helps innovation with healthcare, infrastructure, and all kinds of evolutions. Things get destroyed, things get repackaged. And we call that disruption 1.0. Many of you will know the Silicon Valley use of disruptive innovation from Clayton Christensen. And disruptive innovation is really a specific way for products, innovations, or technologies to disrupt incumbents. It's clearly identified, it's isolated, it's discrete. You can define what is disruptive innovation in the language of Christensen or what isn't. For him, Netflix was disruptive innovation because Netflix was targeting different customer base from the normal ones of the competitors' blockbusters. Uber was not disruptive innovation in the Christensen language because disruptive innovation for Christensen meant that you were targeting different customers. And Uber, although it was a different app and maybe a bit cheaper, it was still the same people looking for a taxi that would use Uber. We call disruption 3.0 systemic disruption. You can no longer identify a discrete or separate it from anything else. It cascades, it evolves into something else. That's why that's the issue with the interest rates, with energy security. It feeds into food security, maybe social unrest. And in a hyper-connected world we're in, everything is connected. And so this disruption 3.0 is an environment which is no longer the one where you're just looking at this technocentric Silicon Valley definition of innovation. The ramifications are important because it means that as you think about your strategy and change, maybe change is a constant. We see 5 fundamental drivers of disruption or change. The first one we label new change. It's a combination of things many of you will know, Moore's law with the chips getting cheaper and processing power stronger, Wright's law, the more experienced, the cheaper it is, the better it is, the quicker it is to produce. Metcalfe's law is the network effect, right? And all of this together is combinatory and self-reinforcing, and this new change is very powerful. The second one is a hyper premium on relevancy. There's a beautiful story with Alice in Wonderland and the sister book by Lewis Carroll, Through the Looking Glass. And the queen is speaking to Alice and says, "You're so lucky, because from where I come from, you need to run twice as fast to stay in the same place." And this hyper premium on relevancy, we call the Red Queen race, whether it's with machines, with knowledge, with short life cycles. But this isn't necessarily good or bad or problematic. We see disruption as neutral. If you are a startup or a young girl in the south of India with a $30 smartphone, you can probably have as much information as a Stanford professor. The startup can probably be as innovative, if not more, than companies. So it works both ways. It depends on your perspective and how you use it. It's neutral. The third aspect, but it does mean that you've got to keep moving, and not just moving with speed, but with agility and effectiveness. Irreversibility is our third cluster. And we put technology separate from AI. We'll have a look why, but it's to do with the decision-making outcomes that AI can provide. And the feature of irreversibility, as the name indicates, is that once you reach certain milestones, it's very costly, difficult, or impossible to reverse. If you can't live on planet Earth, you might want to think about that before that irreversible outcome. Plan B is a little bit tricky. If AI and algorithms reach singularity or artificial superintelligence, you want to think about that before, because that feature of irreversibility is different from other features of change. And then we look at systemic paradigm shifts, complexity moving to center stage. We'll look at what we mean by complexity. Societal changes, and information, disruption, disinformation, the way information is being used, abused, and also its power for the good. And the final one is what we call rapidly approaching new eras. And these are eras which are not yet tangible, but the fact that they are close may arise, and if they do arise, will have major ramifications. What if you get to quantum computing? What if you can produce inorganic life, inorganic humans? What if you live in space? What will be the ramifications of the power struggle between the rising number 2, China, and then the US? What are the implications of that? And so the combination of these 5 clusters for us are the underlying drivers of change. And once again, these are not discrete or isolated or recurring event. Change is a constant. So when you put this together, and the combination of all these, it means that you're looking at certainty being in the past. Everything that you're looking at with trends, market reports, strong signals, which you spend January and February reading hundreds of pages of research reports, basically that's looking in the rearview mirror. There's nothing wrong with looking in the past, but you have to understand that if you can put a market size to it, define the ecosystem, the competitors, the features, those strong signals is like looking in the past. And when you're looking to the future, you're looking at things which you may not recognize. Disruption networks, you're thinking about emerging things, maybe on the fridge, maybe you don't even recognize them, maybe they even might seem strange or laughable. And those that are on the horizon are effectively where you want to pay your attention to, because the rearview mirror is something you have a handle on. The rest is what lies ahead. And so what's happening? Why is there this change? We talked a little bit about uncertainty, right, with the inverse relationship between predictability and uncertainty. But what is uncertainty, and is that what we're facing? So risk, most of you know. Certainly if there are actuaries in the room, you'll know. But risk is really, you know the variables, you know the possible outcomes, and you throw the dice, right? If you drive at a certain speed, well, it's not going to be too fast in Bengaluru, I guess, given the traffic. But on a highway or something, if you drive at a certain speed, what are the implications, the likelihood of an accident? If you decide to smoke cigarettes X per day, you can probabilize it. That is risk. It's something that's understood. Uncertainty, it means you have a sense of the possible futures. Will China be the #1 economy? Will so-and-so be elected? Will country A invade country B? You have a question. There's an answer to that question. You can outline the number of possibilities, and you can ascribe or not probabilities to it. But effectively, that's uncertainty. So what is deep uncertainty, and what is that difference? The difference with deep uncertainty is that there are multiple states of possible futures ahead. But you don't know how to enumerate them. You don't know what they are. You can't necessarily put a hierarchy to them, and there probably isn't an agreement as to what those states are. Will there be singularity? Longevity, how long will we live for? 10 more years, 100 more years? Will you live in space? What inorganic life or evolutions from CRISPR? All kinds of multiple possibilities, the impacts of climate change. Of course, we have a good handle, science has a good handle of climate. Does that mean we know exactly which cities will be flooded, if at all, by how much, by when, what the repercussions of that will be, what the social impacts will be? Once you put all those together and think about how they interconnect, cascade into something else, and play with each other, that basically is deep uncertainty. You don't have agreement in terms of the mitigants. If you take the major considerations like climate, there isn't a consensus in terms of what the issue is or what the mitigations are. So that environment you're in, where you cannot necessarily enumerate with clarity the possible futures, you can't necessarily put a hierarchy on them, there isn't necessarily an agreement and a consensus on them, let alone how to mitigate them, you can't probabilize them, and you don't know how they might interplay with one another, is deep uncertainty, or as Mervyn King, the former governor of the Bank of England, would use, radical uncertainty. So what does this mean? It means that if you are the Fed, or if you're Germany, or if you're Silicon Valley Bank, and you're making one assumption we talked about earlier, and you're relying on that assumption to the exclusion of anything else, you're trying to predict. The issue with prediction is that it only works when you know the parameters, when there's a specific question, and where at that point in time there's a right answer. Now, what prevents prediction? It's when there are multiple unknowns, broad possibilities, and where there may at that point in time not be a given answer. And in those circumstances, you need to think about foresight. Now, just to qualify foresight, because when people see futurists, we all think I might have a crystal ball and I know the future and seek to predict it. It's the biggest paradox. Futurists are the only ones who actually don't seek to predict. If you have a futurist in front of you who's telling you what the future is in a specific predictive manner, run 100 miles. The future is unpredictable. There's no data on the future. What a futurist and what foresight does is appreciate the multiplicity of possibilities, appreciate that some might be more plausible, and think about how to build resiliency and how to build foresight to prepare to be future prepared, futures intelligent around different possibilities. That's the difference between relying on one specific outcome to the exclusion of the other. So it's actually quite simple. It's not necessarily a negative. It's only negative to have this deep uncertainty if your decision-making modes, your boards, and your strategy are articulated on one specific strategy and outcome. It's a simple way that you can avoid that predicament. It's just simply to ask yourself a question. It's very difficult. It's 2 words. What if? That question would save a lot. When COVID, we decided collectively as humanity to save a few $1 billion, we wasted trillions of dollars. When Silicon Valley Bank made a few assumptions about interest rates and the value of tech companies, they might have asked themselves the what-if question, and same with the Fed, about what are the ramifications of having printed money for a decade and having geopolitical events which have knock-on events on food security, energy supplies, etc. So, it simply means that your strategic plans are useful in the same way as the Fed's supercomputers and statisticians are useful. But they are not the be-all and end-all. They fit in a complementary way to thinking about futures which are longer term, futures which are emergent, futures where you might be even more interested in the questions to ask than finding the answer. Futures which are systemic, non-linear, where things spill over. You may be exploring. You're in a mode where you accept and dance with this multiplicity of possibilities. This indeterminacy, it actually gives you agency. It's because the future is uncertain that you have the agency to create it. If it was predetermined, you would have no agency. Not necessarily negative, unless you're using the wrong modes for it. So what does this mean concretely? It means that you need to put through, after this session, a call to your HR departments, and you need to recruit 2 positions. One is a Chief Bridging Officer. The Chief Bridging Officer is basically going to have the agility to connect the future with the present, the linear with the nonlinear and the complex, the simple scenarios and outcomes from your strategy with the multiplicity of strategic foresight and different possibilities, the incentive structures which might be misaligned with the outcomes you might be seeking. That Chief Bridging Officer will be complementary to this Chief Strategy Officer, or maybe you'll actually wonder whether the Chief Strategy Officer is too focused on a specific outcome, whereas the bigger opportunities for value creation or value disruption are outside of the scope of what the Chief Strategy Officer might be looking at. And then the Chief Existential Officer. The Chief Existential Officer acknowledges the risks and opportunities that are asymmetrical. It's existential for a country, for an organization, for business. The success or not, when things are nonlinear, are disproportionate in terms of outcomes. The scope for huge value creation or huge value destruction are asymmetrical. So you need someone who is very focused on those extreme opportunities. And to do that, we need to think systemically. You need to think and appreciate that we're not thinking about point solutions in a systemic context. Systemic simply means that things are hyper-connected, and to drive change in complex systems, you need to apply levers across the system. You can't think about problematics like climate or AI or technology or anything as a business today without understanding the levers for change. And the levers don't have the same hierarchy. Basically, some levers are stronger than others. The strongest lever for change is education, mental models, the assumptions you make, worldviews. Education from the playground to the boardroom. And then the structures. What is the governance, regulations, what are the incentives? Unless you're applying these throughout the different points of the system, you won't be able to drive change. And when you're creating innovative companies, ideas, you're effectively trying to drive change through complex systems. It's discontinuity from what existed. So when you look at the way the world today is operating in silos, where you look at an aerospace company or energy company or technology or media, that basically is an antiquated view of looking at the world. In a complex world, you can't reduce things to their silos. They're all connected. You're thinking about decentralized systems, hyperconnectivity, intelligence, aware. You're thinking about all kinds of, not just technology blocks, but that move away from the simple dichotomies of sectors. Every company has 3 minimum viable fields. One is a technology block, which is moving from digitalization to cognification. The second one is greenessence. Basically, it's renaissance for climate. It's realizing that green is the new digital. Sustainability is the new digital. That to deliver the green energy transition, it affects every fiber and DNA of an organization. And the third element is to realize that in a noisy world we live in, with disinformation, purpose, perception, and stakeholders matter. And so we all need to be, in a way, excellent communicators and storytellers. So where does this leave us? I think a lot of the world, in terms of business and strategy, is very good at understanding convergence. All of you in the room are probably the world's most capable at understanding converging technologies. Intersections, where there's shifts in the value chain. Suddenly, your outsourced cheap components for semiconductors is 80% of the value of an operating system of a car. So the value chain shifts. But what we need to think about with change and discontinuity is what new fields are emerging. What are you not looking at? What is Notco, a Chilean company in alternative protein, which has an algorithm to determine alternatives to protein, to dairy products? Is that an algorithm? Is that AI? Is that a food and bev company? Is it retail? Is it Giuseppe because that's the name of the algorithm and he's a chef? What is even Apple? What is CRISPR? What is it when you can produce diamonds and everything in a lab? What are these sectors that are not sectors, that are emerging fields, which have our 3 minimum viable fields and that are emerging? How do you define an Israeli company that's producing a miniaturized heart? Is that a manufacturing? Is that printing? Is that biotech? Is that healthcare? Is that science fiction? So we need to be very careful, again, about thinking about certainty as in the past and what you're looking at, forward-looking versus backward-looking. And this brings us to the inflection paradox. If it was so simple, why do we miss inflection points? 2 reasons. First is Amara's law. Most of you, many of you might know Amara's law. You tend to overestimate the impact of an innovation short-term, but underestimate the impact longer term. The clash and the paradox is that at the same time there's exponentiality, which is kind of an opposite effect. You don't notice the significant changes early on until it's too late. Think COVID. The combination of the two means that you're overcooking and emphasizing things short term, you get bored of them, the hype of AI, metaverse, whatever, and then it becomes even bigger and greater than you could have imagined. And then what is growing and you might not notice suddenly changes slow until it isn't. That inflection point plays tricks on our mind. We want to think very briefly about artificial intelligence. Has anybody in this room ever heard about AI? Okay, bad joke. So AI is the biggest topic for most people and organizations and society, right? And yet very few, I think about it in a way that's helpful. We look at it as basically a value chain. You optimize, augment, create, and then you need to think about, in complex systems, what does it mean? What can AI do or not do? And this is where it's important to spend 1 minute talking about the difference between complex, we use that term a lot, and complicated. Complicated, you understand cause and effect ex ante. It's linear. You have a range of right answers. There are known unknowns. Basically, it's how do you send a probe to Mars? I can't do it. Probably half of this room can. It's complicated, but science can do it. We understand how to send a probe to Mars. Complex, you only know retrospectively what happens if you have a particular course of action. It's non-linear. It's unpredictable. There are unknown unknowns. There are no right answers. It's emergent and trial and error. A lot of the world's complex challenges, and even technologies, are complex. Society, AI, climate, the economies, geopolitics, the combination of all of these and more. And in this complex mode, you need to operate differently. And AI is not better than humans at complex. And the danger is that when we treat AI as being good at complex and having data on the future, we're delegating authority and we're becoming descaled ourselves as humans. We're giving AI the wrong things to do, and we're becoming less good at making critical decisions. We call this tech essentialism. It's human and algorithmic decision-making. It's our existential and technological condition in the 21st century, where humans no longer have exclusivity on decision-making. It's not a problem unless we don't appreciate where humans are good, where AI is good, and what we need to do to reframe education, our incentive structures, and governance structures. So this is simply what is the nature of human beings' existence and decision-making in our technological world. And if we seek to move too much from predictive to prescriptive decision-making in complex environments which are purely unpredictable, maybe that's where we have a gap. So what is our advice to you? And what is advice? Advice is the opposite of advice. When you don't know the answer, when it's unpredictable and highly complex, don't follow playbooks. Don't follow what your CEO tells you. Don't follow what the consultants tell you. They do not necessarily know. The best advice you can get is to be very thoughtful as to use advice for what is known and understood, but advice become more reliant and critical and understand for your own the environments which are complex, and at that point in time, unknown unknowns. Most of you in this room will know VUCA, is that correct? Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. We think two things are missing to VUCA. And so our advice is to think about what's missing in VUCA and to help that with unpredictability. The first one is exponential. VUCA was created by the military 50 years ago in the US in an environment where things were maybe not as hyper-connected and warp speed. Exponential is meant to reflect the trajectory, velocity, and speed of change. We are on VUCA plus fast. And intersecting is because change happens at the edges when things intersect. That's why we miss inflection points. That's why we mustn't think about life and sectors as if they were formulaic and that. We need to be AAA. We need to be anti-fragile. We have foundations which are anti-fragile, which from Nassim Taleb is the opposite of fragile. It's the difference between Starlink and Viasat satellites. When Moscow invaded Ukraine, they deactivated in 10 seconds the Viasat satellites. They are fragile. 2 years later, the low Earth orbits are still being punched every day and get stronger and more resilient. That's anti-fragile. And you need to be anticipatory. You need to think about the future and the possibilities because you can't predict. But you need to bring that agility to bridge emergence today in the here and now. You need to somehow reconcile the longer-term vision with today because only the present exists. You need the agency to do that and some form of alignment for it to work. That anti-fragility we talked about with Starlink, it means that you're more than resilient. You're getting stronger with every hit. You're heuristic. It's trial and error. It's a little bit, not that I make a big fuss about it, but some aspects of Silicon Valley or even Bangalore that are sort of very agile trial and error. Now, this is nothing new. All we're saying is don't rely 100% on Newtonian mechanical physics. In Eastern philosophy and Zen Buddhism, Mujo, transience, Shoshin, beginner's mind, all of these are ways that we've used for millennia to be comfortable with change. You never put your foot in the water twice, in the same water twice, because the water has moved and your foot has moved. Disruption is therefore a constant. It's not a problem if you have the right perspective. The way you see the world will determine how you prepare for events, will determine how you're able to respond to events. If you don't see the world in a broader, deeper way, you will not prepare for broader possibilities. You'll constantly be responding to emergencies. So you really just want to be that woman on the glider. You need to be agile. The wind will change. You could fall. But you're better off than reading the map that's maybe wrong, that needs updated all the time, and that basically will not be helpful. So that is effectively what I wanted to share with you. I have just published a book this week called Disrupt with Impact, Achieve Business Success in an Unpredictable World. That book is basically a focus on all these topics and more if you're interested in unpacking this. Thank you very much.
For more content on tech and leadership, subscribe to nasscom YouTube channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update.